So in this video, we're going to dig into some of the early or foundational theories of motivation. And what's important to note about these is that in many ways, a lot of these have been, um, as research methods have moved on, these have largely been fallen out of favor in terms of their theories and the credibility of them and the robustness of the findings. But they do help us get a sense of some of the early thinking around motivation. And some of these still retain influence because they do hold still a little bit of robustness and validity. So let's dive in. So some of you may have seen this triangle or a variation of it in the past, and you may be familiar with the term Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so this idea comes from Maslow, who was a psychologist in the 60s, and he posited this idea that people have these different needs that they seek to have satisfied. And by satisfying those needs, they can then move to the next level. And so this is where we get this idea of the hierarchy, that by satisfying the lower level needs, you can then move up to trying to satisfy the higher level needs. Now, this idea of the hierarchy has largely been people have moved on from this. But the idea of the different categories of needs, and definitely the concept of people seeking to satisfy needs, has still been retained because there still is evidence surrounding that. So let's have a bit of a look at Maslow's different categories of needs and think about how they might impact us as individuals, so in a workplace, and then also thinking about as managers or as people, as working with others, how might we start to identify what needs people are trying to satisfy in any given situation. So we have this idea of physiological and safety needs, so physiological needs are just basic needs for survival, and we can think of safety kind of falling into this general category as well. Key physiological needs are things like the need for food, the need for water, the need for shelter, the need to be free from disease, and safety needs being able to not be subjected to weather that's going to endanger us, freedom from violence, these kinds of things. So the idea here is that we absolutely need to meet these needs in order to just survive. And so we are constantly seeking to satisfy them. And so you might think about different work that you do. Maybe you've got a day job that is all about just meeting those basic needs for you, where you just need to put food on the table and pay the rent. And so you do that work, and it's just there to satisfy those particular needs. You don't necessarily seek to get a lot more out of it than that, although it may actually satisfy other needs as well. We then have what we call social needs. So key in here is the idea of a need for belonging, and our identity often being tied to that, and the need for just affiliation as well. So we are social animals. Humans evolved in tribes, so we have a need for each other. And so if you feel ostracized or isolated in a group, this can lead you to be constantly trying to seek to satisfy that need. So this plays out in the workforce, where we might see people just trying to work together, or they might be wanting to just chat, or have ways of actually connecting in with others and working with each other to satisfy these social needs. We then have esteem needs. So this is where often the idea of trying to accomplish something comes in, because that helps us feel a sense of esteem that comes from I did it. So the idea of self-esteem being a sense of pride in yourself and positive regard of who you are, and esteem that comes from others as well. So this is where, as a manager, we might be trying to think about how can we communicate to our team that we respect them and that we have an honouring of the accomplishments that they're having. And in yourself, how do you start to feed your own need for self-esteem by accomplishing goals or working towards goals that matter to you? And then the last category of Maslow is this idea of self-actualisation. So we tend to think of this as the need for growth and for meaning. So we think of this as a sort of higher order, more abstract set of needs that humans tend to have when it in the workplace, it often plays out around people wanting to improve and grow, have a strong sense of meaning from the work that they actually do, so that it's not just so much about, wanting to pay the bills, hang out with people and feel good about who they are and what they're doing, but this sort of sense of I'm actually moving somewhere and what I'm doing matters. So have a think about each of those 5 categories, how they play out in your life and how you might think about identifying them in others as a manager or collaborator. We then move on to McClelland's 3 needs theory, which in some ways collapses Maslow's ideas and looks at it more in terms of work. So Maslow's theory is a general theory about just motivations and need satisfaction for humans in life. And McClelland's theory is much more directed to work, and that these needs become acquired in a workplace. So the first of these, which you'll see relates to Maslow's idea of esteem, is the idea of need for achievement. So we want to succeed and excel in things that matter to us. The idea of people having a need for power. So this is the idea that, generally speaking, we like to influence others, and people, in all of these, people have various levels, and these things get measured often in terms of instruments where people will say, oh yeah, this person has a high need for achievement and a low need for power. So we can think of these sitting across, levels for each one. And these influence what are motivating people. So are people more motivated by achievement? Are they more motivated by wanting power? Or are they more motivated by what is known as the need for affiliation, which is that they want to have friendly and close interpersonal relationships? So affiliation and power sometimes work in conflict with each other, because this is where we're wanting to actually influence and impact the behavior of others. Whereas this is where we're sort of wanting to be more close and work collaboratively with people. So think about yourself. Where do you think you would place yourself from 0 to, say, 10 on each of these needs? And how does that influence the way that you work? And as a manager, how might it influence the way that you work with others, and how you might, if they're different to you on any of these dimensions, how might you work with them? We then have McGregor's theory X and theory Y. And I like to think of this as a pretty just chunky, because it's a sort of dichotomous theory, which means that there's just these 2 theories that sit in opposition to each other. So theory X is the assumption. So, you might have people who behave in this way in terms of, as managers or leaders, they might demonstrate that they are more a theory X person or a theory Y person in their behavior in terms of how they treat employees, or just some of the attitudes that come out. So do they demonstrate that, that they sort of have more the attitude or the assumption that people are just lazy and that they don't like work and they're not going to be responsible, and so you've just got to get them to work in whatever way you can. So you've got to really coerce them or force them. Or do they work from the assumption that people are creative, that they're going to enjoy working, that they want responsibility, and that they can exercise self-direction, so they actually can make good decisions and manage their own workload? So you might have a perception about this, so which one do you sort of sit in more rather than the other? And do you have different attitudes about different people? So are there different people that you think, yeah, actually, I perceive them more from a theory X perspective, that they're pretty lazy and you've really got to work them hard and actually to get them to do anything? Or are there certain people that you think, yeah, I see them more as a theory Y person, where you can just let them go and they're going to, they're all about getting the work done on their own? This theory doesn't hold a lot of water anymore, but it can be helpful just as a really kind of broad theory to think about, one, what's your kind of lens on people, and are there different people that you perceive in different ways? So the last early foundational theory we'll look at is what's known as Herzberg's 2-factor theory. So Herzberg's key insight was that when he was asking people about what were the things that made their job satisfying, that they actually gave very distinct answers when he asked what contributed to your job being satisfying to what contributed to your job being dissatisfying. And so what he noticed was that things that contributed to job satisfaction, so this was like, my job is great, I really like my job. Okay, what are the things that actually lead to that job satisfaction for you? What he found was that there was a whole bunch of what he called intrinsic factors. So this is things that come from inside the individual. So these were things like the actual nature of the work, their sense of accomplishment, stuff like that. So things that actually the person found from within themselves. And the things that actually led to people being dissatisfied with their jobs were what he called extrinsic factors, because they came from outside the individual. So these were more things that were associated with the workplace and the nature of the work. So they sat outside the individual's own perceptions and what came from within themselves. So we can think of these as factors within and factors outside. And so what the factors that contributed to people's sense of dissatisfaction in their job is what Herzberg calls hygiene factors. So we can think of this like, things that need to be in place, but by eliminating these factors, people's dissatisfaction will go down, but it's not necessarily going to increase or contribute to their sense of satisfaction in their job. So let's actually dig into this in the chart that is shown in our book. And again, this is probably a bit more complicated than it needs to be, but let's dig into it. So the idea here is that we have this idea of people either satisfied in their work or they're dissatisfied in this traditional view, right? So if we think of, from 0 to 10, you either hate your job or you love your job. And what Herzberg realized was that these are not a single 0 to 10, right? You're not either dissatisfied or satisfied. But in fact, there's actually two scales going on where you are either, you have a level of satisfaction from 0 to say 10 and a level of dissatisfaction from say 0 to 10. And so you can be satisfied, but also have a high level of dissatisfaction, or the reverse. So let's dig into what this actually means. So these intrinsic factors that go into whether people are satisfied in the work that they are doing or not. So these are the internal motivators that contribute to a level of job satisfaction. So this is our sense of achievement, our level of recognition in work, the actual nature of the work itself. Is it stuff we like to do? Is it personally satisfying? Our level of responsibility, our level of advancement, and our level of growth, right? So the more of these things that we have within reason, the more satisfied we're likely to be at work. And the less we have these, then we have a lower level of satisfaction. Then when it comes to our level of dissatisfaction at work, these are the things that Herzberg identified as in terms of what he called hygiene factors. And so essentially the kind of worse these things are, so we can think of these as, as the name hygiene suggests, we can think of things as like germs, and the more of them, the more that, the workplace is kind of gross and icky because there's not a strong level of hygiene. So we can think of these things as like, how good is the level of supervision that you have? If you work with a bad supervisor, where, you don't maybe have a good relationship with them and they're not very good at their job, that's going to contribute to a high level of dissatisfaction at work. The policies within the organization, do you like them or not? Are they good? Do they help you achieve your work or not? The relationship with your supervisor, the conditions at the work, your salary, relationships with peers, etc., etc. I'll let you actually have a look at them. And so what's important to note here is that these things are actually really important when we want to think about what is going to actually help people not be dissatisfied with work. And then also, we can't just focus on those things because that's not enough. right? So if we're able to achieve a good level of hygiene across all of these things, right? So people feel as that their job is secure, they have a good relationship with other employees, their personal life is okay. All these things doesn't mean that they're actually going to be satisfied in their job. So we also need to be thinking about these factors if we want to think about how we're going to have people that love their job and feel a sense of satisfaction in their work. All right, so that covers off those early theories of motivation. In our next video, we're going to dig into some of the more recent theories.